In November 1950, one of the most powerful fighting forces on Earth walked straight into a frozen trap and didn't realize it until escape was almost impossible. What began as a confident advance suddenly turned into a fight for survival in one of the coldest places imaginable. High in the mountains of North Korea, victory seemed close. The enemy appeared broken. The war felt nearly over. But hidden movements, brutal terrain, and a deadly miscalculation were about to collide hard. At a place known as Chosin Reservoir, tens of thousands of soldiers would be cut off, surrounded, and slowly crushed by cold, darkness, and overwhelming force. Supplies froze. Weapons failed. Roads vanished into snow and fire. How did one bold decision place an entire corps in danger? And how did this nightmare begin? To understand that, we have to go back just weeks earlier when everything still looked like a victory. Just weeks before the catastrophe at the Chosin Reservoir, the mood among United Nations forces was one of triumph. Following the audacious amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950, U.S. and South Korean troops had pushed deep into North Korea. The North Korean People's Army was collapsing, and General Douglas MacArthur believed victory was near. Orders were given to push all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China, with the goal of reunifying Korea under the South's control. But that confidence would soon prove deadly. As the U.S. X-Corps, including the elite 1st Marine Division, advanced through the mountainous terrain of northeastern Korea, their forces became dangerously dispersed. Units were spread across vast distances, often with little support between them. The terrain was unforgiving steep ridges, narrow roads, and sub-zero temperatures that drained men and machines alike. Despite the risks, commanders underestimated China's willingness and capability to intervene. That changed in late October 1950, when tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers from the People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu under the cover of night. They moved silently through the mountains, using stealth and terrain to mask their numbers. By the time their presence was confirmed, it was too late. The Chinese launched a surprise offensive with overwhelming force, encircling U.S. and UN positions in the Chosin region. They aimed to cut off and destroy the X-Corps piece by piece. The 1st Marine Division, which had been advancing near the Chosin Reservoir, suddenly found itself isolated. Their units were scattered across key points like Udamenye and Hagaruri, with only a single narrow mountain road connecting them. The division's flanks were exposed, and the long supply line back to the port city of Hungnam was under constant attack. Chinese troops turned the rugged landscape into kill zone, setting up ambushes, blowing bridges, and launching brutal night assaults. But perhaps the deadliest enemy wasn't even humanite. Was the cold? Winter in the Chosin region was extreme, with temperatures falling below 30 grados bajo cero. Radios stopped working. Plasma and morphine froze. Food became rock solid. Marines had to eat frozen beans like popsicles. Sweating during a march meant frostbite. Rifle bolts jammed. Soldiers picked ice from between their toes and watched wounds turn to red icicles before they could be treated. Medics sometimes gave dying men pencils and paper to write final letters home because there was nothing else they could do. The combined force of freezing temperatures, mountainous terrain, and relentless enemy assaults pushed the 1st Marine Division into what many believed would be their final stand. Completely surrounded, low on supplies, and fighting against overwhelming odds, escape seemed impossible. But what happened next would defy every expectation and turn a certain defeat into a legendary act of survival and resistance. If you're finding this story as gripping as it is brutal, consider supporting the channel. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what came next was unthinkable. By late November 1950, the situation was dire. The 1st Marine Division and attached U.S. Army units at Chosin were completely surrounded by an estimated 120,000 Chinese soldiers from the 9th Army Group. The Chinese attacks came in brutal waves, mostly at night, with bugles and screams piercing the frozen darkness. Marines described the enemy as endless. The hills looked like they were moving, reported U.S. pilots overhead. It wasn't just a metaphor. Entire formations of Chinese infantry were pouring over the hills, outnumbering U.S. troops by as much as 35-1. Sleep-deprived, frost-bitten, and low on supplies, many believed the entire force would be wiped out. The psychological pressure was immense. Human wave assaults by the Chinese left bodies, frozen in the snow. So many that Marines began stacking them like sandbags around their foxholes to brace for the next attack. Survivors described the eerie silence between attacks and the fear of freezing to death before the enemy even arrived. At this moment of apparent doom, leadership became the dividing line between collapse and survival. General Edouard Almun, commander of the 10th Corps, initially proposed an emergency evacuation, abandon heavy weapons, destroy equipment, and fly out the wounded from Hagururi. But Major General Oliver P. Smith, leading the 1st Marine Division, refused. He believed a chaotic flight would guarantee disaster. Instead, he proposed a radical plan to fight their way out, holding the division together and bringing out as much equipment and wounded as possible. His philosophy was simple but powerful. Retreat? Hell, we're just attacking in another direction. Smith's choice reshaped the entire campaign. He emphasized maintaining unit cohesion, keeping artillery and supplies intact, and ensuring no man was left behind. While others saw retreat as surrender, Smith treated it as an opportunity to maneuver with purpose. His insistence on discipline, planning, and resilience under fire created the framework for a fighting withdrawal that could withstand the worst the enemy and nature had to offer. The withdrawal began on December 1st. The goal: break out from Udamenye, link up at Haguri, then push south to Hungnam. The terrain was treacherous, and the road narrowed just one icy, mountainous route, constantly ambushed and shelled. The 5th Marines led the way, guarding the convoy of vehicles, while the 7th Marines moved through the hills, attacking Chinese ambush points and relieving the defenders at Tokdong Pass. Artillery units leapfrogged in bounds, ensuring there was always cover fire. Marine and Navy aircraft bombed enemy positions ahead of the column during daylight. Fighting Wasanti Jusk Constantit was calculated. Every inch was contested. The Udamenye column reached Hagururi by December 4th, after days of combat and forced marches in sub-zero temperatures. Their arrival secured the airfield, allowing for vital airlifts of ammunition and the evacuation of more than 4,000 casualties. The rearguard actions, covering the movement of trucks and wounded, became battles of attrition, fought with frozen weapons, raw courage, and bitter resolve. Logistics became a battlefield of its own, with trucks frozen and fuel lines cracking. Every movement required improvisation. Diesel fuel became more valuable than bullets. One artillery battalion had to abandon half its guns north of Hagururi when the tractors ran dry. Supplies were flown in by transport planes under enemy fire. Marines unloaded crates of ammunition, fuel, and food, sometimes with their bare hands, despite the biting cold. They used plastic explosives to thaw frozen canned rations. It warmed the outside, one Marine recalled, but left the inside frozen, so he'd stab it with a knife and eat it like a popsicle. Even communication was crippled. Radios froze. Medics had 2 warm morphine syrettes in their mouths before use. Blood plasma was useless unless thawed by hand. Diarrhea from frozen or spoiled rations debilitated many. Frostbite was rampant. Rifles jammed mid-butt. Every action from aiming a weapon to bandaging a wound had to be done in conditions that could kill a man in minutes. The line between survival and collapse was painfully thin. The most dangerous point came at Funchelin Pass, south of Katuri. The Chinese had destroyed a bridge, spanning a deep chasm, cutting off the only road to the coast. Without it, the entire column would be stranded in the mountains. The U.S. Air Force responded with an unprecedented operation. It dropped portable bridge sections by parachute piece, falling into Chinese-controlled territory under fire. Marines assembled the sections by hand, racing against time, while Chinese snipers targeted the engineers. Enough of the bridge survived the drop to allow vehicles to cross. This single act of battlefield engineering saved thousands of lives and kept the retreat moving. It became a symbol of ingenuity and determination under fire. The fact that an entire division depended on these fragile sections, dropped from the sky, underscored how precarious the escape truly was. This moment turned the retreat into something even greater, a feat of coordination against overwhelming odds. But not all could be saved. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed thousands. Men froze in their sleep. One Marine was seen with his jaw missing, replaced by frozen icicles. A corpsman told him there was nothing he could do, that the man would die once thawed. He handed him a pencil and paper so he could write a final letter to his family. When Lassayan, the Marine, was outside the tent, writing in the snow-covered dark, These moments captured the unimaginable emotional and physical toll of the campaign. Marines faced not just bullets, but a climate that turned even rests into danger. Layers of clothing froze solid. The mere act of relieving oneself required removing gear, risking frostbite, or worse. Soldiers often couldn't tell if a comrade was asleep or dead until they checked for breath. In this nightmare landscape, every man fought a personal war against despair, exhaustion, and death. By mid-December, the shattered survivors of the 1st Marine Division reached Hungnam, where the U.S. Navy had established a massive evacuation point. With the Chinese still pursuing, troops dug in to defend the perimeter. On December 11th, the final rear guard arrived. Over the following days, 100,000 troops, along with nearly as many civilians and vast amounts of equipment, were loaded onto ships in one of the largest military evacuations in history. It was the end of the road, but not of the war. The Chinese 9th Army Group, though numerically superior, had suffered devastating losses. Between 40,000 and 80,000 of their soldiers were killed, wounded, or incapacitated, many by the same cold that ravaged the Americans. The sheer resilience and tactical discipline of the Marines had not only saved the X-Corps, but it also crippled one of China's most powerful fighting forces. What was once seen as a disaster became a display of courage, strategy, and human will. What unfolded at the Chosin Reservoir was not a defeat, it was a tactical miracle. Against overwhelming odds, the 1st Marine Division and attached U.S. Army units executed a fighting withdrawal that preserved their strength, saved thousands of lives, and crippled the enemy. It wasn't just a retreat, it was a masterclass in military endurance, leadership, and coordinated resistance. The Marines left the mountains bloodied and battered, but unbroken. Strategically, the consequences were immense. Though the Chinese achieved a geographic victory by forcing the X-Corps to abandon northeastern Korea, they paid a staggering price. The 9th Army Group was effectively destroyed, suffering between 40,000 and 80,000 casualties from combat and the brutal cold. It would take months before they returned to the front. For the United Nations Command, the Chosin campaign dispelled any notion that Chinese forces were invincible. It also marked a turning point in the war's tempo and psychology. Hungnam, where the retreat ended, became the site of one of the largest military evacuations in modern history. Over 100,000 troops, and nearly that many civilians, were pulled from the coast in a massive operation that underscored U.S. logistical power and resolve. More than a simple extraction, it was the culmination of a campaign defined by discipline and sheer human will to survive. The legacy of Chosin endures not only in military textbooks, but in the memories of those who lived it. Veterans of the battle remember the freezing darkness, the frozen food rations, the fallen comrades, and the relentless will to push forward. They didn't just escape, they inflicted massive losses, preserved their integrity as a fighting force, and redefined what was possible under the most impossible conditions. In the end, the impossible retreat stands as a testament to the power of leadership, the strength of unity under fire, and the brutal cost of resilience. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was the moment that showed the world what true endurance looks like when everything seems lost.